She's a member of parliament in Canada. She was the first female commissioner of Ontario Police. She's also a former president of Canadian Association of Chief of Police. She's currently part of GI's board and founding advisory council member of the Resilience Fund. Welcome, Gwen. And also at the beginning of the Resilience Fund, when we launched it in Vienna, was there Diana Siger, also joining us from Mexico City. She's an activist, feminist, and member of the GI's network of experts. She's head of the environmental justice and human rights organization GI-TOC. And her work focuses on civil society, on putting into practice integrated approaches for environmental and social justice and promote resilience in rural communities and in cities. Diana has experience working in artisanal mining in South America, accompanying mothers of missing people in Mexico, and a whole range of things. She has also been a mentor of the grantees of the Resilience Fund for this project. So welcome Tuesday, Gwen, Diana. But first, we're going to start with my colleague Rada. She has also, of course, been at the beginning of the Resilience Fund, following how we build this knowledge about gender and organized crime. And Rada is one of the co-authors, together with Faith Gum, who wrote a policy brief about the information we gather from the fieldwork, from consultations with the Resilience Fund community platform, to unpack the ways in which women are struggling, adapting, and responding to the impacts of environmental crime. So, Rada, welcome, and let's get started.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Today, thank you so much for joining us. And as Syria introduced the topic about environmental crimes and biodiversity loss and how they impact women in indigenous and rural settings, we wrote a policy brief, We wrote a policy brief basically exploring this issue in four forest ecosystems, which are the Ecuadorian Amazon, in the Sierra Occidental in Mexico, the Yabasi Key Biodiversity Area in Cameroon, and tropical rainforest heritage of Sumatra. So very diverse communities as well, but we did find some commonalities. We took the help of national local research assistance to go and collect primary data. We also looked at available literature to substantiate some of the ideas and findings that we found. So obviously the main question is, what are environmental crimes? Well, this was beyond the scope of the policy brief because we are all still figuring that out, because what is legal and illegal are kind of different, the interpretations or the perceptions from the community. And this particular brief was looking at how local communities, specifically indigenous communities who are facing a lot of loss as a result of all the demand for natural resources that we have. And we are looking at, and they basically have but they basically are the ones who are the victims, you can say, or survivors of any anthropocentric ecological plunder that we are witnessing today. But anyway, just for the sake of this brief, there is organized environmental crime, which converges with illicit economies of human trafficking or drug trafficking. And then there is also the crimes against the environment, which basically could be, quote unquote, licensed actors plundering the ecological balance and nullifying the land that indigenous habitats have existed for a long time. Some of these categories below: illegal logging, wildlife trafficking, illegal mining, illegal unregulated and unreported fishing. These have been sort of enshrined in international legal frameworks and some domestic frameworks, and they do have some elements of commonality, like they do fair in domestic in different countries to be illegal activities, but then it's still very blurry. So this is not the scope of the brief. Anyway, so what we are looking at is the environmental crime, the impact on women and their perspectives from the perspectives of indigenous communities. So gender roles and relations are at the heart of our understanding of how this impact affects these women and men differently. So women are expected to fulfill nurturing roles, domestic care, household roles, while men, they are expected to fulfill some sort of income generating activities. They're also expected to leave the house, and they're also employed in maybe the extractive industries that are established in their habitats. But women, they have to take care of their family, they have to take care of the food, they have to take care of their children, and they also practice subsistence farming to like kitchen gardening, for instance, or just small farms around their homes. But men are the typical decision makers. They are also the ones who have land rights. They are also have access to resources, and they are also generally viewed as the ones who are the bread earners of a household, while women are basically submissive, and they have all their roles are about the household. Now, this is somehow we found that it affects the gendered impact comes from these areas. So what happens is that now women, typically they're in indigenous households, they have to collect firewood, they have to collect water, and they have to basically travel distances to upkeep their household. But then when there are environmental crimes or there are large extractive industries or operations, that leads to the presence of a lot of non-native and foreign men in the area, which inevitably increases their vulnerabilities and disrupts their expectations, their social expectations of getting firewood, because that would require them to venture deeper into the forest areas, where they basically interact with men that they don't know or not from the society, and the rest. They also have the environmental degradation also has differential impact on women's health because of their biological constitution, their maternal health, and how water, contaminated water or soil can directly affect a pregnant woman. It also, on the other hand, increases their caregiving roles. So this is something that women are then supposed to take care of their entire family, who have basically fallen sick because their environment is so polluted, it's so toxic, that they have to stop everything, forget about looking after themselves. They have to look after their family members. This has also sort of come up as it stops women accessing formal education, for instance, dropping out of schools. And just to go back to the point of masculinization of indigenous territories, schools are located pretty far from where they live. And when that happens, even kids cannot really go to school because there aren't really like roads or buses or public transport, for instance. And that also, in terms of healthcare centers, they're far out. So they're not, it's a lot for them to really travel these distances. Then, of course, the third point, which is connected to all of them, is food insecurity and malnourishment. And this, with these loss of arable land, loss of culture, loss of medicinal plants, and all of that leads to a lot of malnourishment, and also loss of bushmeat, like protein sources, for instance, because of excessive hunting. And this really affects them a lot. And kids, for instance, they become super malnourished, and they're not able to then go to school. Of course, the household is falling sick, and this is something that is really the responsibility of women, actually, which then can lead to gender-based violence, because a lot of reports from the ground have said that men, because they become so disillusioned by the complete change of their cultural landscape and their environmental landscape, that they take it out on women. And the domestic violence has reportedly increased in certain parts of the world, as among these indigenous communities, as a result of the loss of land, as a result of land conflict, and all of these different anthropocentric impact on disturbing the ecological balance. But another thing that we also understood is how women, they are often found in these illegal mining sites or logging sites as sex workers. So there's a lot of sex trafficking involved, and women are again expected to fulfill that role in a really masculinized operation or space, economic space. And so that is another thing that we have seen. And then we also don't know what leads women to be perpetrators of any of these environmental crimes. They're definitely not, as we've understood, any leaders of these criminal operations, but there has been reports of women being like ferrying things from one place to the other, for instance, minerals or even small animals. There've also been reports of women recruiting young girls into these sex trafficking operations. So there's a lot of these effects that are happening very on the outset. So what are the recommendations? Now, these recommendations were calibrated following local dialogues that we did, in-person local dialogues that we did with multiple stakeholders, especially the communities themselves that we had interviewed for this project, and in these on-sites, so in Ecuador, in Indonesia, in Cameroon, and in Mexico. And they have come up with some of these recommendations, which is to integrate gendered considerations into plan interventions and advocacy. So here it means that we must increase women's participation by creating women-only spaces and women-only dialogues when it comes to environmental management and policies. We also need to expand women's networks at the grassroots because of this masculinization of territory that happens, and the major support you get is from other women. And so this is definitely one, and expanding women's economic agency and political participation, because women, I think 80% of women are involved in agricultural activities. This is like majority of agricultural activities are performed by women, but they're super marginalized when it comes to the decision-making processes. So their agency needs to be increased, not just through educational workshops, but also through economic empowerment. So not just going and upskilling them, so they have maybe skills for artisanal crafts, but you must also empower them to market those crafts, connect them to urban centers and markets, and also help to provide other forms of skills that you need to survive in the modern day. So facilitating women's rights campaigns at community and regional and national levels. Some of the communities that we interviewed said that there was absolutely no political participation of women, and that was, of course, very shocking and hurtful for us, because there is no realization of the impact women have in small units, in communities, in their families. But we have to facilitate women's rights campaigns at community, regional, and national levels, and you must build solidarity among grassroots organizations and movements, and then build awareness, raising on relevant issues that occur in the ground, and also tell them about things like, you know, these human trafficking networks or rackets that are going on, which would basically offer them jobs and then put them in one of these mining sites. Then you have the infamous boyfriend technique, which almost every desperate woman falls prey to because of lack of anything. So these are the things that they need to know about it. It's not, and we know about it from a macro perspective, but on the grassroots, there is actually very less awareness. Another one very important is protection of women environmental defenders, because women are perceived to be weak. So there's a lot of then there is no sort of hesitation in intimidating women who stand up against any sort of criminal activity happening in their environment, or if they're standing up to any sort of land grab or land conflict that's happening. So that's definitely something that is a cross-cutting or cross-sectoral issue, like for governments, for civil society, for academics, whoever, to understand that protecting women environmental defenders is work, and we have to focus on that. Building coalitions with other social movements and organizations. This is kind of directed at civil society also, because there's so many different organizations working in silos, like an environmental organization and a women's rights organization and a child's rights organizations, but you might want to connect those so that there is more concerted efforts and with women's with women's rights being in foregrounded. So that, and then autonomous management of diverse income generating activities. This, we understand, this is somehow for the governments to maybe promote other sort of economic activities for women, and also to maybe look at sustainable practices in the forests, and also support them, also connect them to the markets like non-forest timber products, etc. But this is something that they need to diversify their sources of income. Finally, we have to collect the gender disaggregated data on the effects of environmental crime. This is very important because we don't know at all how and why women are affected differently and men are affected differently. And this data can be collected not just by academics or policymakers, but also by civil society organizations that work on various issues. And this will help us actually make more concerted policies and help the women and actually communities on the ground. This is what I have very quickly. Thank you for your attention. Yeah.
Thank you, Radha. And I want to go back to the question on why are we doing this? Why are we talking about women, and why is this important? And like I said, from the perspective of the Resilience Fund, women have always been key actors as respondents, because when it comes to community resilience, we see the value on these networks, we see the value on the role they play in the communities. But also we hear in Radha's presentation, we hear a lot of things that are still new in the language of civil society organizations, like gender mainstreaming, global policies, just throwing things like we must include gender perspective, gender disaggregated data. And at the local level, and even sometimes at the national level, we struggle to understand what these things mean. So there is a lot that needs to be done. So I want to go back again to the question, when we have 80% of the people who are displaced by climate change are women, according to the data. I want to go back with Tuesday and ask her, why are we still talking about women? Why do we say that organized crime in general affects women differently? And why is it relevant to talk about women when we talk about environmental crime?
Thanks, Surya, and thanks, of course, to Radha for that excellent presentation, which encapsulates, I think, many of the ideas that are the answers to the question you've just asked me. I mean, the study of organized crime and the policy practitioner response to organized crime has evolved a lot in the last, I would say, 5 years or so. I mean, historically, and even now, organized crime is a very masculine issue. More than 95% of people involved in organized criminal activity who are prosecuted for organized criminal activity are men. Men are the perpetrators. They are also actually by far the majority of the direct victims of criminality. So they are also the ones who are most likely to fall into traps of getting caught into criminality early because it appeals to them from a demographic perspective, and then never being able to escape that again, the consequences of having, fallen into the criminal justice system and failures to identify viable ways to rehabilitate and reintegrate them. So, we've always talked about organized crime as being a man's problem. And where the study of organized crime and the concentration on organized crime looked at the issue of women, it was always as victims. So there is no question, women are heavily victimized by illicit activity in criminal networks. They are typically focusing in areas of human exploitation, so victims of trafficking, both labor and sex trafficking, but also as victims of what is often a very hypermasculine culture, which I think Rada's comments reflected very well, that comes with criminal governance. And regrettably, because of the intense masculinity in the organized crime debate, often punishment of women is something that is done within criminal groups that are fighting. So, they will attack girlfriends, they'll attack family members in order to hurt criminal groups. So, we've focused a lot on the issue of women as victims, and the debate continues to do so. But broadly, certainly from criminology circles, there's a general recognition that there's a lack of agency around women's participation. And actually, both from a positive and a negative standpoint, women are involved in criminal activity and they are playing increasingly instrumental roles. But I think to focus on what we find most positive and important, and I think why conversations like this are important, and what Rada's presentation highlighted, is that women play this really interesting and very influential vector role. So, in violent communities, it's women who serve as the intergenerational transmitter of the most negative consequences. So, women who live in situations of violence are destabilized. They often have higher rates of broken families themselves, early pregnancies. They transmit domestic violence through to their children, which creates a next generation culture of violence or crime or economic hardship. So a lot of the policymaking response, and where the Resilience Fund, I think, feels very deeply, is that's as much as they transmit negativity through the generations, they also have the potential to transmit positivity. And we've seen through our own work and the Resilience Fund's work that women are the ultimate in change agents. They are the leaders in protesting to criminal governance. They are the ones whose influence can really matter in the way that if they speak with integrity, if they speak for the importance of change at a community level. So I think where we need to be more granular and more focused is on turning women from being a negative source of vector transmission of the negativities of criminal governance into the positive role models they can be. So how do we address issues of prevention? How do we address issues of protection? How do we address societal dynamics in a way that can make them less vulnerable? And I think that's overall, almost, it's become a really compelling field of analysis and an absolute priority for the policy community.
Thank you. And Tuesday, that was really well summarized on the why. But I also want to follow up now with Diana Sijer, because she's also been part of, from civil society, part of those movements of women. And I want to ask her, follow up what you said, to expand on the role of women in civil society organizations to address environmental crime, which is particularly what she's looking at.
Sorry. Thank you, Syria. Well, I'm gonna, before responding to that, Syria, before talking about the role of women in civil society organizations responding to environmental crimes, I would like to say something. As a Latin American woman, I do believe we are closer than men to have caregiving roles. And we tend not only to become natural caregivers, but also to experience feeling differently than men. And I'm not saying that men don't feel, but there are differences. Differences that are situated in our bodies and that are also built according to our experiences and our culture. And maybe we could be talking about historical experiences like colonization or local experiences like domestic violence. And this is probably one of the reasons why using female-sensitive approaches and methods like disaggregating data that was already mentioned or applying the intersectionality lens are very important, because we need to spell out the differences from our common standpoint as women. And we need to do that loud and clear. So women who seek to join a civil society organization that focuses either on protecting the natural environment or defending women's rights or indigenous rights are women who may not only be standing up for human rights or environmental justice, but we are usually women who somehow feel and know that the multiple social inequalities and systematic oppression and extreme violence on our territories and on the non-human environment needs to be urgently addressed. And that is if we are to preserve life and if we truly care for living. So I think that roles of us women on these organizations are crucial. And that is if we want to achieve adequate responses to environmental crimes. Because somehow feeling and caring makes us act. It gives us that agency upon the injustices we are perceiving and experimenting. Then on the other hand, we have different ways that organizations may be responding to environmental crimes. I mean, there's basically organizations working on these issues for different reasons. In Mexico, some organizations, for example, do research and reporting on environmental human rights defenders. And I mean legal cases officially registered or posted by media. And these are organizations that are trying to do awareness raising and an advocacy type of work. And in recent years, those reports have mostly become women-led. And that's very interesting to see, because you can read and tell the difference from past reports. You can see how categories on violence have extended, for example, and how data is now being disaggregated by sex as much as possible, and how there's a growing effort on connecting the issues and impacts, mostly in cultural terms. So there's some work to be done, but I think there's a lot of progress in this regarding the information of violence and environmental crimes being reported nowadays. Ever since women started taking part on analyzing data and coordinating processes of gathering information and reporting. Then other organizations that are more grassroots-like or that keep it more local focus on offering support for claiming legal and human rights. And I'm talking about access to justice. And that alone is a huge relevant job. And when women are part of it, it is more likely that women victims of environmental crime approach them seeking for help on how to demand protection or how to start legal action. Since women who have been victims of crimes and oppressions, particularly indigenous women, commonly fear speaking out. This is something we know. No, this is not new, especially when talking about rape or physical abuse or psychological threats. And in the Sierra Tarahumara in Chihuahua, for example, in the north of Mexico, environmental crimes may begin with raping a woman just as a sign of control of organized crime linked to drug cartels. And in other cases, fires may be induced or land is occupied by illegal loggers. And in those cases, women victims of this crime will walk for hours to reach the authorities and very likely suffer some form of discrimination when they're denouncing. So who would these women turn if their bodies are abused and if there's a chance of their chance of accessing justice is taken away by men? Other women, we already know that, and I think Radha mentioned we need to build these local networks because we tend to look for other women for help. And women on these organizations are so important that maybe they're not aware of it, but they are the doors and the main bridge to the possibility of differentiated justice. So the role is locally is key. And finally, there's another set of organizations that are also very important in responding to environmental crimes. Those that keep their actions more eco or bio-centered and that therefore advocate for nature conservancy. In these kind of deep green organizations, environmental criminals are basically the enemy that needs to be exposed, judged, and needs to be punished. And the importance of women's role in these organizations is growing more and more every day in Latin America. Why? Well, because it's very likely that women in our countries have experienced some kind of oppression, and that allows us to have a deeper understanding of a subjugated and dominated being, even if it's of a non-human nature. So in that sort of empathic form, where our bodies recall violence, we tend to be more connected to non-human natural beings and to the planet as a whole. So women on organizations that do direct action for nature preservation commonly show true commitment to denounce environmental crimes and criminals, putting themselves out there at high risk. And I believe this is also key to bring about justice and change. So wrapping up my participation, I would say that there's a diversity of civil society organizations that may be found to be responding to environmental crimes. And if women are an active part in them, we probably are going to find that these organizations are responding in a more adequate and a more female-sensitive manner, and therefore will be more effective, even if we're still on a very long road to achieve true justice. And that is for human and non-human nature that are being affected by environmental crimes. So that's what I have to say. The role of women, like also Tuesday pointed out, is crucial. We know that we need to support these women and protect them as well.
Yes, and it is crucial, and you both have touched on something that is also very crucial, which is also the women's perspective on doing this work. Women as researchers, women as journalists, women as activists, women as law enforcement, how, it's not just as, in the communities or doing resilience, but how this presence of women in different environments affects the way we do things, transform the type of responses we have. And you also, Diana, you touched on something that was going back to the discussion on the why, like, why are we doing this? And when we chose this project and the 4 places that connect this project, it is a forest. And I think when we look at the forest ecosystem, it is very clear to see how the forest means something for men and women. And, that was it was challenging, like I said, to try to connect the dots in countries that have nothing to do with each other, where the understanding of gender roles are very different, languages, etc. But at least we knew that forests everywhere in this planet means something different for men and women, and that was sort of our thread. But going back to the different roles that women play, and in the different areas that we have, I think when Senator Boniface, you have been on the other side of this equation in law enforcement. And I think, usually law enforcement responses have been at odds with women's responses, with indigenous groups, community-based responses, but we're seeing an evolution of that. And in Canada, your own country, my homeland now, we've seen also an evolution on how law enforcement approach, community-based approach to protecting the environment, to conservation, are also recognized by law, because we are seeing that when we're talking about environmental crime, environment degradation, it is unavoidable to include women and indigenous groups at the table. So what do you see? What have we learned? What can we do better moving forward?
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Syria. This is a great discussion. In terms of moving forward, I think Deanna eloquently covered, the whole question of equality. I mean, it's a fundamental piece of it, and that captures across the lines. So when you think about, the strength of the environmental movement, and what I heard from Deanna, which I'd written down as well, as women supporting women, is trying to make sure that the voices are heard across organizations, both obviously in the defenders, but politically as well. There's an expression here that I hear often from our Indigenous community, which is "nothing about us without us" argument. And so you have opportunities. I think there are opportunities to amplify the voices of women, and your report speaks very much about how important it is. I was struck by the quote that was, "not to challenge gender roles, but rather to reclaim their voice," was one of the quotes. And I thought that is extremely important. I also think that it's about taking up the space that is rightfully ours, because for so many women, and I would agree with Deanna again, is that this has a different impact on women, and it needs to be heard through that voice. And I also think it's really important to understand and raise awareness, which the report speaks to. It's raising awareness about the challenge that these women in these communities, particularly Indigenous and rural communities, face with both legal and illegal activity that's impacting their communities, their space, their forests, as Deanna would say. I'll speak, if I can, very briefly on, you flagged the law enforcement, and I think it's an awareness raising. I'm a huge advocate for getting more women in law enforcement, so that you can get a perspective that's more reflective of society. I'll use the Senate as an example. So stepping outside law enforcement very briefly, the Senate in Canada is 50% women, and we're, it tips up and down, but right around 50, never has it been that. Guess what some of the primary issues are that are voiced in the chamber, led by women? Environment, childcare, reproductive rights. This is the difference that it makes when you have a diverse voice at the table. So I would say law enforcement obviously would benefit from that as well. I think it's also, and flagged in the report, about awareness raising in terms of the impact of the impact that these issues have on women particularly, but also understanding how you in law enforcement are able to help get the message out in a fashion that ensures safety of people. And I'll use protests as an example, and this is an issue that Canada, as you know, Syria, has faced with particularly in the dealing with Indigenous communities, but in all communities. And law enforcement here in Canada has taken a very different approach than they did, say, a decade or two ago. And that is, they have teams of people who actually meet with the community groups and try to understand what the message is they're trying to get out, and try to help facilitate that message going out in a manner that's safe for everybody involved. It's been a very significant change of approach. It's had both its supporters and detractors, but I think what we're seeing is, and what history will show is that we're recognizing that all voices, not just some voices, need to be heard, and law enforcement has a role in understanding that. Now, I fully appreciate that we're all at different stages in terms of experience and awareness of these issues, but I think it's a really unique opportunity for law enforcement globally to better understand these issues. And I think the greater the awareness, the more positive it is. And I'll leave it at that because Deanna and Tuesday covered the rest so well.
Yes, that was very, very good follow-up. And I think, I don't know if Diana or Tuesday have anything to say about that. We also have a question, not from me, but from Nukila Evanti, one of the members, one of the grantees of this project. She's in Indonesia. She's an amazing female activist dealing with, of course, all sorts of organized crime as well. So if you guys don't have anything to follow up to that, I will show Nukila and her question now. So can we share the screen, Adrian, for that? Thank you.
I'm Nukila Evanti from Indonesia, recipient of the Resilient Fund. My project is an advocacy for indigenous women and women in local communities to survive and fight against land concessions and land grabbing. I have questions to Tuesday Retano, Deputy Director Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. My question is, Global Initiative or GI-TOC is the front line of the fight against organized crime, especially environmental crime. The question, how to internalize reports, research, and data from GI-TOC to national policy and strategic makers so that they are more meaningful.
Thank you for the question. Shall I just go?
Yes.
I mean, it's an excellent question. I think one of the hardest challenges to answer, and I'm sure Gwen will also have many ways to add insight onto this, is how to make policymakers sit up and pay attention, and maybe more importantly, how to make politicians sit up and take attention so that they provide the leadership and the budgets that are necessary for policymakers to implement. So one of the flaws I find a lot in the discussion around transnational organized crime is the desire to move, first of all, with a financial value. So there's always the desire, well, how much is it? How much is it? And to speak to the money. And particularly, I think the fact that the crime is often defined as a predominantly financial consideration. Criminals are looking for the profits. But in something like environmental crime, what we have found is the need to really transition to a wider focus on harm. So, and it's quite unique to environmental crimes because the real harm of the crime happens at the point where a tree is felled, a species is killed in order to feed illicit trafficking, which is not necessarily as true for other forms of illicit markets, where often the harm is done at the end of the supply chain when, say, a illicit arm is used for an act of violence or something, or at the point of exploitation. So we find that if you can use a far more nuanced discussion around what the harms are of a crime, and then maybe to talk about the manifold consequences of those harms. So, environmental crime has some benefits because it is so tightly webbed into the discussion around climate change. So you can very quickly step to arguments around the rate of deforestation, the rate of denaturfication of the ocean environments, for example, and speak to wider harms. But you can also make connections to livelihoods, to socioeconomic issues, and those sometimes can be quantum. When we did an analysis, way back when the SDGs were first propagated, we noticed that organized crime was impacting on about 19% of the 169 goals and targets in the SDGs. And some of the largest points where we were seeing limiters to the achievement of our core development goals were in the areas of the environment. So I think speaking to it in the context of, first of all, what are the broader harms? How is it going to retard other policy objectives is a good way of getting emphasis on to some of those conversations.
Thank you, Tuesday. We have another question from one of the other grantees, and it's the reason why we have them on video is because, sometimes these live events that are predictable, two of our panelists may leave. I made a doctor's appointment whilst you were answering the questions, so we wanted to make sure to include their questions. And I'm happy we got to include this question from our grantees in Ecuador, and I'm happy to have grantees in Ecuador for this project, because also when we saw all the terrible news in Ecuador and people were talking about Ecuador in such a negative light of events, it was really encouraging for us to know that at the same time when we spoke with our grantees, they were still ready to continue their project. And the beautiful thing of these women in Ecuador is when you're looking at a extreme organized crime violence event, to think that there are indigenous women who are still getting together to create art with the youth, to keep going, to keep the peace. And they have been doing this for hundreds of years. I think that, there's a beautiful lesson to understand on resilience there, especially when we're seeing, current events and the levels of violence. So I'm happy to now have, and she's also joining in the chat. So she's live, but we also have this video with her question. Please, Adrian, can we play it? It's coming. Yes, thank you.
Hola, mi nombre es Karen Novoa y soy la coordinadora del proyecto de empoderamiento comunitario para disminuir la deforestación en los páramos de la Esperanza en Ecuador. Y mi pregunta para las panelistas es cómo desde la sociedad civil nosotros apoyamos a las personas, a los ambientalistas, a los líderes comunitarios que defienden a la naturaleza, como lo llaman acá los indígenas del Ecuador, a la Pachamama. Están amenazados de muerte muchos de ellos. Entonces, ¿cómo los protegemos desde la sociedad civil? ¿Qué hacemos para que estos líderes y lideresas no sientan amenazada su vida por estar defendiendo los recursos naturales de todos? Eso, muchas gracias y pues saludos desde Ecuador.
Y gracias por tu pregunta, Karen, y por estar ahorita aquí en el evento. Y para mí esa es una pregunta crucial y me gustaría... Oh, I just switched to Spanish, sorry to the interpreters. That just came totally natural. And, I was supposed to stick to one language, but my subconscious betrayed me. I was thanking Karen anyway. And I think that's a crucial question to address in what we have for the rest of the time today. The issue of protection. And this is an issue that our grantees in the time, and we cannot avoid to talk about the dangers, the high price of protecting the environment, the risk in addressing environmental crime, the incredible risk and effort that it takes for some of these women today in this call working in these environments to do their work. And the threats are also different, men and women as well. Like Diana said, like you've mentioned, there's always the threat of sexual violence, the threat of rape, the threat of disappearing. And I would like you to start, Diana, to address Karen's question, and then I will go with you, Tuesday, and Wen for closing remarks related to what we've spoken today, but, highlighting the issue of protection. Diana.
Okay, I'm gonna do Spanish now since the question was done in Spanish. Algunas de las cosas que podemos hacer las mencioné durante mi participación, pero sin duda en países como los nuestros, como Ecuador y como México, es un gran reto. Es un gran reto y lo más importante es poder apoyarnos como mujeres y realmente no perder la esperanza de entrar en una red y de estar escuchándonos y de hacer lo posible por llegar a la puerta de la justicia y exigirla. Entonces, bueno, poder escuchar a las mujeres indígenas, poder escuchar y acompañar a las mujeres defensoras ambientales y de derechos humanos es ya un gran, es un gran rol, es ya una manera de poder fortalecernos y poder llegar a avanzar ante estos grandes retos. Y bueno, no sé, creo que precisamente el Fondo de Resiliencia GI-TOC, ¿no? Y los grantees en los países, sus proyectos son un gran ejemplo de lo que necesitamos hacer para fortalecernos. Entonces, mi gran recomendación sería no dejarnos vencer y seguir la lucha juntas, ¿no? Eso es lo más importante.
Gracias, Diana. Thank you, Diana. Before we go, we wanted to keep this dialogue to an hour because our panelists have to leave, but I want to acknowledge the people in the audience who have been asking questions, and I just want to take a moment to thank them and to read their questions, because perhaps if we don't have time to answer all of these questions, our team will take note of these questions, and maybe we can back to you with a follow-up for this conversation. But Jean-Paul Geoffrey, how can we ensure that the voices and perspectives of local and indigenous women are heard and respected in international discussions and policies related to environmental protection? Claudia Lucero Sobrino, she's asking, can we really talk about women's and indigenous communities as part of the same box? That's a very interesting question that I don't think we'll have the time to address today, but like I said, our team is making a note. Tamilin Palacios, what are some names of the adversaries or operating in near of these 4 forests? That's a very interesting question, and one of our researchers, Radha Faith, is also in this chat. We didn't really go deep into addressing the criminal groups operating in this forest for this particular report, but I invite you to read what the GI has published in terms of Ecuador, Cameroon, and there would be more information there in terms of the organized crime dynamics that are not necessarily included in this report. And from Maria Sabine, she's asking about protective mechanisms that are effective. I think Diana addressed a little bit of that. Tamilin Palacios, where do harms against women fit in this adversaries operation? And yes, I think Tami is from Priority Sustainable Counterterrorism Program. I think there are a lot of issues that also are related to this conversation that we won't get the time to cover, and that's unfortunate. But like I said, this was meant to be a dialogue that hopefully will be the beginning of many more things, as things usually tend to be in the Resilience Fund. We start with a conversation, we find some people who want to or are interested in the same things, and we keep it moving, we take it forward. So I want to ask just first Gwen for some final remarks, and then Tuesday for you to close the events. And thanks everybody for their questions.
Well, thank you very much, Syria, and to everyone who asked the questions. I think I just want to reemphasize, I think this is an opening dialogue in terms of the really important questions as we move forward, and particularly when we talk about safety of women. I'm really struck by how much that overlays all of these issues with respect to the environment. So I want to commend the report. I think it really opens up an important issue. There's 2 points that I would sort of close with, is that, participation is crucial, as Deanna said, and I think that's at all levels, including at the political level. And I think the other point that I heard consistently is data. Let's make sure that we understand, as Tuesday had said, that the data will help us connect the issues of health, of community well-being, of social well-being, and major issues like malnutrition and the impacts. So I would really emphasize in closing that it is not just this sort of singular issue of how do we deal with environmental crime, and particularly through women. It's all the impacts and those that women care for, the people who women care for, and the community at large that are at stake. And I think that's really important. And thank you, Syria, for this opportunity. I think it's, like I say, a great opening dialogue.
Tuesday ended well.
No pressure. Thank you very much for that. I think I was interested in the questions, which a lot of them said, what is done? What is done? What can we do? How do we make a response to this? And I think the sad reality is the answer to many questions is it's not talked about. Nothing is done. There's not enough to do in protection at all for people dealing with environmental harms. And there certainly isn't enough done for women who suffer harm, both in environmental context and elsewhere. And, it's sort of depressing to be us every day in a way, because you see the atrocities that are committed and how awful they are and how incredibly brave a lot of our community activists are in the face of people who are way, way more powerful than they are. So, I'm going to be very corporate and answer this in that, what we feel our role is to, first of all, to help give the voice. And I think that's very important. It was a certain message through everybody's comments that, for people whose voice isn't projecting far enough, we as, those of us who have the benefit of access to international communities, to the media, to other policy and stakeholder groups, we can help bring the voice. And we do that in the GI through bringing, members of our Resilience Fund to the United Nations to speak in various events. We can try and catalyze, we can try and support by building networks. We can help people, I think a very core ethos of the Resilience Fund is that people need to feel that they're not alone, that they're not fighting alone, that they're not isolated, but there are experiences that they can learn from, there are people they can draw upon, and even just to feel that there's a world around them that understands and is trying to help. And so between these two things, you make the issue more prominent, you bring it to the table, and then hopefully then you catalyze a set of responses that weren't there before. And for us, it's also a question, I think, of understanding what works, what can be successful. How do we help people to understand that, these giant problems, and, we talk a lot about these wicked problems like climate change. Climate change is an enormous problem. Violence, levels of violence, corruption and impunity, huge global problems. But actually, they have quite practical solutions. And for us sometimes to say, bring it back down, what works? What do we know that works? And how do we encourage policymakers to take those steps that will make the problem better, not worse? And so, some of the questions, some of the discussion points, about hyperlocality. How do you, as an international organization, be meaningful at a local level? Similarly, how do you make local realities resonate at an international level? And I think all of us here in this conversation feel that we are part of that effort of translation, both up and down. So I think that's my answer to a lot of the questions that were in the chat. Not enough is done, but we can help. And we should help, and it's our duty to help.
Yes. And like I said, we hope that this is the beginning of a conversation. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining, for being part of it. We hear you. We'll continue doing this. Thank you to the team for organizing, the interpreters, and everybody who participated. Looking forward to see you again. We are recording this, so there will be parts in social media, so you will hear from us again. Thank you so much.